Right, comrades, I think it's perhaps a bit of a pity that we're gathered together on such a nice summer evening to talk about Ramsey Macdonald. So many of us too. It seems a pity. The only reason for it, really, why I chose to do it, is I've always been fascinated by Ramsey Macdonald, perhaps for this reason: if there are any people who believe in stars here, or those curious phenomena outside the universe, that's a very important fact about him. He died on the 8th of November 1937, which was the day that I was born, which proves, I suppose, nothing more than that the torch gets passed on in this great labour movement of ours. I want to start with where I came in as a socialist, which is in Glasgow. And when I went to Glasgow and became a socialist for the first time, people talk there, still talking, about the general election of 1922, which was the first election, really, when the Labour Party started to win votes in great numbers from the Liberals and became really the chief opposition to the Tories. They weren't quite the chief opposition, but it was obvious that they were going to be. 1922 in Glasgow, there were 15 seats, and 10 of them were won by the Labour Party, where only 3 had been won in the previous election. And there was a tremendous transformation. These votes had been won by great propaganda, great effort. In every street mouth, for instance, in the constituency of Bridgeton, in every close mouth, there was an ILP representative. There were pamphlets and leaflets for the streets, not just for the areas or the wards, but for the streets. Tremendous agitation. Tremendous argument. And when the results of the election were declared, and all these very left-wing socialists were elected for Labour in 1922, 120,000 people came to St Enoch's Square to bid them farewell to go to London and come down to Parliament. I was active in the Labour movement in Glasgow in 1961 to 1964, and I never remember seeing more than 8 socialists gathered together in St Enoch's Square at any given time, and that was usually by accident. So it was quite a phenomenon to remember just the extent to which this parliamentary endeavour and this electoral process had excited and invigorated masses of people throughout that city, and indeed throughout the country. Now, when they came to Parliament, those MPs from Glasgow and from elsewhere, those red Clydesiders, as they were known, there was an immediate problem that faced them. And it was a problem which hadn't really faced the Labour Party in Parliament before, in any serious way, and that was the problem of the leader. When the Labour Party started, it started as a representative of trade unionists in Parliament, and there wasn't really a leader. There was a chairman of the parliamentary committee, and that rotated in the way in which perhaps chairmen of trade union branches rotate. In the ordinary business of trade union democracy, you don't set up somebody as some great leader, or you didn't in those days. And the leader of the parliamentary party wasn't anyone who was terribly important, but on this occasion they decided that he was important, really the first time that he became important, and they had an election. The leader of the Labour Party at that time, or the parliamentary Labour Party, was a man called Clines, boring, dull, efficacious, did his job, didn't really know where he was going and didn't really care. The sort of person you'd expect to be chairman of a Labour Party parliamentary committee. And the Red Clydesiders didn't like him. They thought they ought to go for someone charismatic, someone who had stood out against the establishment, someone with some force and power. And they were instrumental, those Red Clydesiders were instrumental in putting up as their candidate for the leader of the Labour Party in 1922, none other than James Ramsey Macdonald. They heralded him and argued for him as the son, illegitimate, that's of course the expression they use, not the expression we use, but the son born out of wedlock to a farm girl in Lossiemouth who had an affair with the and the Cromwell was always very keen to point this out, with the head ploughman at the farm. And the result, from the poorest possible background, this man had joined the Social Democratic Federation, as most socialists had done in the 1880s, had then taken a much bigger step and joined the Fabian Society, which was much more to his liking, but during the war had been opposed to the war, had sacrificed his chairmanship of the parliamentary party before the war and his parliamentary seat in order to oppose the war, and during the war had brought upon himself all the antagonism of the ruling class that they had, particularly for traders and especially for labour traders. And therefore those Red Clydesiders took Ramsey Macdonald to be someone who had incurred the wrath of the establishment, who knew how to stand up to the wrath of the establishment, who was charismatic, who was a wonderful speaker in public. He spoke for hours and hours. He always spoke for hours and hours. There was a ratio, inverse ratio, the number of people that came, the longer he spoke. And he was good at it. He was a rhetorician. And he was someone who they thought would help to put Labour on the map and was much better than someone like Clines who represented the old days. And therefore Ramsey Macdonald, by way of really intrigue, really rather quite nasty intrigue, beat Clines at that election and got elected leader of the Labour Party, a job which he held for nearly 10 years. Now there were some Marxists among those Red Clydesiders, people who grew up not in the tradition so much of the ILP, but also grew up in the tradition of Marx and took the view that class was the characteristic of the society that mattered most in it. And some of them were a little uneasy about the election of Macdonald because some of them had read and heard what Macdonald had said in the past. And they noticed this, that whenever there was any unpleasantness, Macdonald's word, that is, any strikes or industrial unrest, or any upheaval in the working class at all, Macdonald had intervened at crucial moments, sensitively intervened at crucial moments, in order to roll back that tide, and to place in front of people who believed in that kind of activity as a means to change society, the alternative of gradual reform. That was his theme from the moment he joined the Fabian Society at the end of the 1880s, all the way through. And he'd written that you had to write then, you had to write all the time, you couldn't go on the television and waffle, as some people do today. There was no opportunity to waffle to the masses, you had to write to the masses and get it read, and you had to go and speak at public meetings, and he'd done that over and over again. Here's a little book, Syndicalism, J. Ramsey Macdonald, 1912. You'll know that 1912 was at the very peak, or just at the end of a peak, of great industrial unrest, as people in railways, in the mines, and all over the industries of this country started going on strike to get rid of the values of the employers, and in the course of doing that, established a political philosophy which was denounced as syndicalism. It wasn't always syndicalism, but which took the view that the way to change society was in the activity against the employers. Macdonald wrote this book, Syndicalism, which is a very ferocious attack on that view from beginning to end. This is what he puts in its place. The new order, and people talk all the time about the new order, socialism. The new order is to arise not by the smashing up of the old, but by the maturing of the old itself. In other words, what existed would mature in some autumnal way into something completely different. The apple would grow on the apple tree until it became a banana. in a gradual way. Social growth, not class conflict, is to produce it. Social growth is to produce it. By growing socially. I don't know if you have been doing any social growing recently, but anyway, by social growing you could replace the old social order. And therefore, in its place, what is the alternative? The alternative is this. Parliament is essential to social coherent life. Its social legislation will become more precise as it is brought up face to face with the actual problems and as its knowledge becomes more accurate. It is the only guarantee we have that bad industrial conditions will be levelled up, that parasites will not be allowed to prey forever on other people, that the moral inspiration of a few will be secured by law as a privilege to the many, that there is continuity in industrial policy. And if you're beginning to notice, which you certainly will have noticed in about 50 minutes' time, the way in which this man writes and speaks, not dissimilar, by the way, to the way in which another man, whose name I won't mention, but you may catch from time to time in your head, speaks, that instead of saying, when a thing can be said once, you don't say it once, you say it 4 times. You say it over and over again with different words, and it sounds more impressive. There is therefore a real unity called the nation. That's what he decides. And every dominating interest and class produce within themselves forces which ultimately change them. Well, that's really very interesting if you're interested in the working class changing society. No need for that, because the dominant class produces within itself forces which will change it. Remember, Marx had said the capitalists are their own grave diggers, see, and MacDonald really, in his intellectual way, took that a bit further. He said, well, the capitalists are their own grave diggers, and they bury themselves as well. They fall into the graves. When they build, they dug the graves, and then they jump into them. So really, there's no point in really doing very much about it, we can just watch them jumping. A state, such as the syndicalist says our present capitalist states are, a state is therefore not a stable relationship. It's a relationship, and here now, give you this as an example, very early on in his life, give you this as an example of the way in which he wrote and thought and talked. It's a relationship in whose fabric change is busy, through millions of tremors, impulses, jars, decays, substitutions, and more particularly through the unceasing activities of the moral consciousness, which is always planning better things, beautifying, dreaming, and the horizon of which is being widened by every progressive step taken. See, when you hear a thing like that, it's very impressive. When you read it, you think of the beautifying and the unceasing activities, and then of course what you realise is he's saying that the thing will just change of its own accord. Just let Parliament be elected, the Labour government be elected, and the society will change of its own accord. Well, that was in 1912, and after the war, he set to work again. Here's a little book, The Socialist Library, editor, J. Ramsey Macdonald. You'll find them in second-hand bookshops. Most of them quite good socialist propaganda. Parliament and Revolution. The ILP believes in the class conflict as a descriptive fact, but it does not regard it as supplying a political method. That's the head of this book here. In other words, we can see the class struggle, there is a class struggle going on, but any political solution arising out of it has nothing to do with the class struggle. That's something quite separate to it. And there again, he wrote, that was in 1919, Parliament and Revolution. In 1921, Socialism, Critical and Constructive, by the Right Honourable, he is now the Right Honourable J. Ramsey Macdonald. Now this again, a lot of this book is quite a good account of the case for public planning, for planning the economy, for not allowing the economy to be at the mercy of the market, those sorts of things. There's a wonderful little passage, for instance, about the public parks of London, which is quite interesting. And then he ends off, revolution is not a mark of progress, but a mark of the temporary check in progress. In other words, when there's a revolution, it's a sign that things have gone back a bit, and we must really try and smooth that out and go forward. Both these books, of course, the one in 1919 and the one in enormous length with the Russian Revolution, and explain, great care, how the Russian Revolution has resulted in something which is not democratic. What existed in Russia was the banning of the Parliament, the Constituent Assembly. He went over and over about that. He took the subject of the Soviet and dealt with it as whether or not it was democratic. It didn't represent everyone, it only represented workers in plants, and what about the old people, and what about the young people, the people who weren't workers in plants. All those arguments fielded with great care, and ending up really that revolution is the mark of a check in progress rather than progress itself. That class conflict was not the way forward, and that socialism can only move men by education and moral idealism. That was the conclusion of all this little line of theory that comes up to MacDonald in 1922, when he's elected leader of the Labour Party by the left and sets about converting people to socialism by education and moral idealism. In 1923, May and July, there was a debate in the House of Commons. I don't know whether you have a Hansard for that period, but if you didn't by any chance, some bourgeois publisher rushed out a special edition, read both sides and judge for yourself, socialism or capitalism which, now this is a matter that's discussed in Parliament, socialism or capitalism which, difficult to imagine it, but this is the motion. This is the motion moved by none other than Philip Snowden, the leader of the Labour Party at that time. This House declares, this is the motion, this House declares that legislative efforts should be directed to the gradual supersession. I've never seen that word ever before or since, by the way, in the whole of the reading. I don't know if anyone else has ever come across the word supersession. I suppose it means what happens when you supersede something. It's the noun from supersede, anyway, sorry. It's directed to the gradual supersession of the capitalist system by an industrial and social order based on the public ownership and democratic control of the instruments of production and distribution. The crucial thing is that it's done gradually. We'll talk about what we're going to do. We're in some doubt about that. We can see the societies all along it's got to be changed. But the point is that it's going to be done gradually. And every Tory MP that got up and denounced them, there was a Labour leader to step in and say, look, we're not for revolution, we are for doing it gradually, because we want to get the votes at the next election. And here's, just as an example, I like throwing in these examples. The debate was ended, of course, by Ramsey Macdonald himself. What more suitable? I will conclude. I wish I'd heard him speak, and then I might try and imitate him, but I won't try. I will conclude with one quotation from a Liberal leader who is still with us, but having no pride of place in his party, to which he belongs. Lord Morley, in the Fortnightly Review, Lord Morley, we won't get to him anyway. Lord Morley, in the Fortnightly Review, wrote a letter which contained this sentence. Now listen carefully to this. This is the conclusion of the debate, socialism or capitalism, which, quote from Lord Morley, we shall need to see great schools before we can make sure of powerful parties. Not bad, have you? Meanwhile, whatever gives freedom and variety of thought and earnestness to men's interests in the world must contribute to a good issue. That's the end of the quote. And then Ramsey says, that is my creed. That is my faith. That is why I'm in favour of socialism. I don't think like this till I heard Howard Wilson speak. Birmingham Ragmarket, you know, when he used to say socialism means the quality of life. That's what he means. I think very much in that tradition. Anyway, the motion was defeated. I'll give you the figures, if you like. For socialism, 121 votes. That's 143 Labour MPs at the time. So I don't know where the other 52 were. For capitalism, 368. Majority for capitalism, 247. End of the matter for the time being. However, at the end of 1923, you know, there was an election, and that election was even more remarkable than the election of 1922 from the point of view of the Labour Party. The vote went up again, not as substantially as it had done in 1922, but it went up enough, marginally, in the way that these psephologists talk about what percentage the alliance needs to break through. Well, Labour broke through at the end of 1923, formed the government in 1924, with 191 seats to 259 Tories and 159 Liberals. Still balancing there, and the figures take up much less than the Tories, a few more than the Liberals, but they did take office. It was felt that the Tories had lost 100 seats and couldn't very well take office again, and so the Labour government took office, and Ramsey Macdonald became the Prime Minister. And I want to refer you back to what he said about the state in that quotation that I referred to, how the state changes itself, it has its own contradictions, its own jars, its own moralities, which shift itself, and once you get change in Parliament, you'll see all these changes starting to take place in the state machine. And very interesting examples of that took place in January 1924, when the Labour government took office. The first thing Ramsey Macdonald had to do was to go and see the head of state, who no doubt is also subjected to all kinds of jars, emotional problems, different things which changed him. And which one was this? King George V was very courteous. Very nice to see you, Mr. Macdonald, and very glad to see that you're properly dressed, which he was, by the way, and he used to dress up with terrific care. There is one matter that he would like to raise with Ramsey, if I can call you that, Mr. Macdonald, and that is this rather embarrassing meeting that you had in the Albert Hall to celebrate the Labour victory, in which the red flag was sung. We don't approve of the red flag. The King said it's a revolutionary hymn. Well, it's not much that, but anyway, he took it to be a revolutionary hymn, and when it was sung, he saw the flag being pulled down outside Buckingham Palace and all that sort of thing. And so he said, well, what are you going to say about that? And Ramsey offered his deepest apologies to the King that the red flag had been sung. He said it was worse than that. They were talking of singing it in Parliament. When the MPs came, there's very little that he could do. Would the King please understand the difficulty that he had with the extremists, particularly these people from Scotland, these vile creatures from the Gorbals, people of that time who come down, who really didn't understand good manners. One of them, John Wheatley, who he was going to put in his cabinet, refused to wear court dress. Refused to wear court dress when he went to take the seals of office from the King. Did he understand the desperate situation that was raised by that kind of problem? And the King said he understood very well, and he hoped, in the famous words of Dame Margot Asquith when she wrote to Jimmy Thomas in 1917, keep tight hold of your men. That was the advice that the King gave to Macdonald, and he determined to do so. When he started to appoint ministers to his new government, he had, for instance, to deal with the question of the law. You know, that's a part of the state which is subject to jars and emotional problems, all kinds of changes that can take place through their own in their own impulses in the law. And so, in order to ensure that didn't happen, he appointed as Lord Advocate in Scotland H.P. Macmillan, a prominent Tory barrister, a Tory candidate in the last election. He became the Lord Advocate in the Labour government. The Lord Chancellor, who was in charge of all the law, was a man called Lord Haldane, who joined the Labour Party to become Lord Chancellor. He's written to Baldwin, actually, saying, for heaven's sake, hang on, don't let these Labour Party people in, although I'm a member. If they do get in, I'll see that I'm Lord Chancellor, and we'll see that there's no real changing in the law. The first Lord of the the First Lord of the Admiralty, in charge of the Navy, which is also part of the state machine and therefore subject to jars and changes and all kinds of emotional problems, was the former Viceroy of India, an arch Tory, treasurer of the Tory party, Lord Chelmsford. He was appointed First Lord of the Admiralty in the Labour government. A Labour man was appointed head of the army, Stephen Walsh. He went down to the generals, he spoke to the generals there. He says, I know my place. You have commanded armies in the field, and I was nothing but a private in the ranks. That was very generously received by the generals when he said that. The Secretary of State for the Colonies was Jimmy Thomas, who called all his staff together on the first day and announced to them in a single sentence everything that he stood for as far as the colonies. I'm here to see that there is no mucking about with the British Empire. Macdonald wasn't just Prime Minister, he modestly appointed himself Foreign Secretary as well, and proceeded to do nothing whatever during the first few months of the Labour government. There was a budget, I don't want to be unfair to them, there was a budget. The chief proposal in the budget, which was passed unanimously by the House of Commons, was the corporation tax, which taxed company profits should be abolished. Philip Snowden, who was the Chancellor of the Exchequer, said that he was not vindictive against any class or interest, and that was received with prolonged cheers on the opposition benches. And by the end, or as we got near to the year, people were wondering about the gradual supersession. You see, the supersession wasn't happening at all, but that it was happening, but that it wasn't. The supersession wasn't happening, and it wasn't happening gradually. That is roughly how the thing happened. Instead of having a gradual supersession, you had no supersession taking place gradually. That was and it's quite interesting that the publishers, Cassels, the bourgeois publishers, that had published Socialism, Critical and Constructive in 1921 in order to win votes for the Labour Party, came to Macdonald at Downing Street, and were well received by him because no doubt he had substantial royalties on these books, and said, look, how about an updated edition? Your Prime Minister will sell thousands. We'll just pre-reproduce it. You don't have to do any work. We'll produce another edition. And he said, I'd like to write a preface. He specially insisted on writing a new preface while he was Prime Minister in Downing Street to a book entitled Socialism, Critical and Constructive. And it's quite interesting. What's happened here is that the ideas which are in the book, some of the ideas that are in the book anyway, of socialism, are all gone out of the preface. They've all gone completely. And what's left in here really is an appeal to the working people of Britain to work harder. That's really what you've got here. I'll read you something. This is the end of this. This is the end of it. It cannot be overemphasized that public goals, popularism, you know, I mean, sophisticated audience, you know what popularism is. I mean, it's 1921, people not paying the rates, rate capping campaigns, Camden Council, Lambeth, Ted Knight, all that sort of thing. Cannot be overemphasized. Well, Ted Knight sort of divided by 10, I mean, or multiplied by 10. It cannot be overemphasized that public goal, popularism, strikes for increased wages, limitation of output, not only are not socialism, but may mislead the spirit of the policy of the socialist movement. Socialism calls men to give unstinted service in return for a reasonable reward measured in terms of life. And no one should be more impatient than the socialist with the fallacy that a man cannot be expected to give the service before he gets the reward. The socialist, therefore, looks with some misgivings upon the recent development in the conflict between capital and labour. They are contrary to his spirit. He believes they are both immoral and uneconomic and will lead to disaster. It is only when the worker by hand or by brain does his best for society that he will create in society that sympathy and support without which the labour movement will never attain its goal. J. Ramsey Macdonald, 10 Downing Street, June 1924. Nothing there at all. Nothing. We're not doing anything, but we are absolutely insisting on the gradualness with which we're doing it. With which we're not doing it. And the same theme coming up. Gradual supersession. No, supersession. Take everything in good time. We'll leave out supersession, but we'll keep the gradual. I say usually that the 1924 Labour government was the best Labour government we've ever had, because it didn't really have the time to do anything. It was only in office for 10 months, and really you couldn't say that I don't think it broke any strike, for instance. There weren't any to break, so therefore they didn't break any, or not none to speak of. There wasn't any really big offensive against the working class movement. They were getting ready for it, but before they could get ready, the Tories and the Liberals got together and drove them out. It doesn't matter on the issue, you all know what the issue was, but they drove them out and had an election in which the Tories were returned with an enormous majority. So this process starts, whereby you build people up to the great expectations that are going to take place as a result of this electoral procedure. You build them up on the basis of a hatred and horror of the system which is exploiting them. You go and make propaganda and build their note and get them all excited and interested in the thing, energize 120,000 people into Enoch Square, for heaven's sake. You get all that activity and you go and do nothing, and as you do nothing, the same horrible system, as you cooperate with it and collaborate with it, the same horrible system pays you back. It's the same process that goes all the way through by stamping you on the head and driving you out of office. And then the first occasion of another very familiar thing to us over all these years. 1925. The Labour government is out. The Labour government has done nothing. There has been no supersession of anything at all, and therefore there's a tremendous rise in left-wing agitation, left-wing determination within the Labour Party. Socialist clubs were established under George Lansbury, Poplar, a man from Poplar, who'd gone to prison for his beliefs, and therefore was beginning to be believed as the grand old man of socialism who had once done what he believed in and was likely to do again. And the socialist clubs had a manifesto which they set up all over the country, in all different kinds of places. A Labour government should be pledged to establish a socialist state. Its job would be the reconstruction of the state on socialist lines, and it would be pledged to take on that job and carry it through. There would be no more of the ins and outs, no more of the swing of the pendulum. It must be determined to carry through its proposal and stay until it has become impossible to stop them midway or sabotage them. It must end the fallacy of national government before anything else. It must cast to the winds a doctrine of continuity with the past and replace it with a creed of loyalty to the future. Labour's slogans must be, get power and keep it, no more of the ins and outs. And then there was a long, long list which would horrify you if this list was read out in any offices of the Daily Mail today. They'll have a fit. All taking office, Labour should receive an assurance that in case of need a sufficient number of peers would be created to carry a bill for the abolition of the House of Lords. This will have to be selected from reliable sources. Every 100th elector of Poplar or every 1,000th member of the Finance Federation should be made a peer in order to drive the House of Lords out, abolish the House of Lords, and on and on. Let Labour choose its own cabinet, down to the dictatorship of the Prime Minister. No fraternisation with a class enemy, break the continuity of society tradition, no court dress, ration houses, no slums cheat by jar with mansions, invade the precincts of the upper class. Abolish race slavery, abolish it. Capture the last stronghold of the governing class, the ranks of the diplomatic service. Democratise the diplomat. The present force must be reduced and further reduction sought by international agreement. Workers' militias should replace the regular army. Make the soldier a policeman. No barrack life, no death penalty. On and on and on and on. These were the proposals put up by George Lansbury, Susan Lawrence, Marion Phillips, Ernest Thurtle, John Skerr. Not names that many of you would have never heard before, but just want you to keep those names in your mind. Just hold them in your mind for a moment. 1925, workers, militias, invading the palaces, all those things were the policies which once again begin to revive the notion that by this parliamentary process you can drastically alter the state of affairs in society. Macdonald, of course, hated the socialist clubs, he hated the Communist Party, but the mood was such in 1925 that there was precious little he could do about it. Worse was at hand than the formation of the socialist clubs. Red Friday 1925, the alliance between the unions in support of the miners against the depression in pay for the miners. Macdonald spoke to the delegates on May the 1st, spoke to the delegates of the TUC, May the 1st, 1926, which called the general strike. We will stand our corner. Don't you make any mistake about it. It's the trouble when people ever say, don't you make any mistake about it, you know that's when they all start making a mistake about it. Don't you make any mistake about it. We will be by the miners' side, because it is a just side, an honourable side. A case of coal, remember that? He stood his corner for about 22 hours. For most of which I reckon he was sleeping in the corner, presumably. And then on the 3rd of May, House of Commons, with a discussion of general strikes and Bolshevism and all that kind of thing. I had nothing to do at all. This is in the middle of the strike. He attacked the strike at in the House of Commons. He consistently, from the start of the strike, did his very best to sell it out, and eventually his aide, the former Secretary of State for the Colonies, Jimmy Thomas, actually did sell it out by going along and persuading some industrialists to patch up some compromise which wasn't a compromise at all, but just for the owner's benefit. And Beatrice Webb records in her diary, "The strike will fail, I'm glad to say, and it will lead to a rehabilitation of political method and strengthen JRM's leadership within the party." Very shrewd woman. That's exactly what happened. She was glad the strike had ended because she saw that the strike, everything associated not only with the general strike but with the miners' strike that followed it, or the miners' lockout which followed it, was a quite different political tradition, and set in motion new political ideas, something quite different to those which she represented, and something quite different to those which JRM represented. And she saw that if the strike was defeated, and why it should be defeated was this: if it was defeated, then the influence of Ramsey Macdonald and Beatrice Webb and all the reformers who believed that you could change it from the top down would be tremendously assisted. The strike had failed, and direct action was out, and we then come into that period which has so many echoes going back in the past to the period we're living in today. Not precise, no echoes are precise, and all sorts of things are different, and circumstances are different, but the echoes nevertheless come through in a history dominated by the struggle between the classes. We look out all the time for those echoes. The only point of reading history, as a matter of fact, because if there's no relevance to the present or to the future, what's the point of looking at the past? The direct argument was that the strike had failed. It didn't fail, it was sold out, it wasn't ever tested. But since it had failed, and since the miners had been broken to pieces, and with the miners the whole trade union movement effectively broken to pieces, then all that kind of activity was no longer worth thinking about. that now every effort of socialists had to be put into parliamentary action. And therefore all those people, those who believed indeed in parliamentary action, those socialist club people, those militias, those people in favour of the militia people and the people for invading the houses of the rich, even those people should shut up about those policies, because if they didn't shut up about those policies, it would affect the possibility of winning more and more votes at the general election, and therefore winning positions in government which could change the circumstances. It was a time of tremendous witch hunt in the Labour Party. 23 constituency Labour parties completely disaffiliated from the party because of its association, its refusal to disassociate themselves with Communist Party members. A real nastiness, a nastiness which I remember in the early 60s coming from the right wing of the Labour Party. Indeed, not only the right wing, but assisted by sections of the left who had previously been very much for free speech, turning not only against the dissidents, but in a really nasty and brutish way against them. I went the other day to speak to the Heath Labour Party, which is a branch of the Hampstead Labour Party. Went there and was cheerful and cracked a few jokes for a couple of them, and I've never, in any meeting in my life, ever been attacked in quite such an unpleasant way as it was at that meeting. And that move, which wasn't there a year ago or 2 years ago, we look back 1926, the move to 1925 on the up, the move in 1926 on the up, the defeat of the industrial movement replaced then in the political movement, saying on the argument that we can replace it, replaced by tremendous attacks on the left wing, even inside their own parliamentary strategy. The Cook-Maxton Manifesto, Cook, the leader of the miners, A.J. Cook, and Maxton, Jimmy Maxton, tremendous orator, known for his beastliness in the House of Commons, the Beast of Glasgow he was known as. I mean, you'll be getting the echoes. He's a terrific, tremendously popular orator among the Labour rank and file. Wherever Jimmy Maxton went, he was hailed as a tremendous orator, someone who really spoke well from the heart, who was for the fight and the battle, and believed in the battle of his class. Jimmy Maxton, Cook, and the person behind the Cook-Maxton manifesto, the person who was behind it all, who tried to build inside the left of the Labour Party at that time a last despairing effort, trying to do everything he could in a very, very commendable way. John Wheatley, perhaps one of the greatest figures in the history of the reformist movement in this country, and very much neglected as a result of it. John Wheatley, the orchestrator of the Cook-Maxton Manifesto, man who had been in the 1924 government, and because he'd been in the 1924 government, had lost a great many of the illusions that he'd had previously in parliamentary government. Again, the echoes coming, the personnel attaching themselves, the Maxton Skinner, Wheatley Ben, that these people pushed all the time out, pushed out of the mainstream, pushed into the sidelines because of this tremendous demand all the time that we should have unity for the electoral process. Labour and the Nation was the name of the Labour Manifesto for 1929. Labour and the New Social Order had been the name before. Labour and the Nation was and the change, the shift all the time. There were some specific pledges in the manifesto, but the manifesto, as this next manifesto, will read very, very fudged, very uncertain, very small aspirations, not much talk about nationalisation of this or that, very few things that we're going to do, very specific, something that's within our grasp, Labour and the Nation. And of course, all the time, Ramsey Macdonald. By-elections were won. All sorts of extraordinary results in by-elections. And in 1929, when the election came in May, there were 8.3 million votes for the Labour Party, something like a 35 to 40% increase in the vote that should have got in 1924. And for the first time, the Labour Party finally established as the chief opposition to the Tories, to the social order, whatever you wanted to call it. A fantastic lead. They all even won in 1929 Brecon and Radnor, and they only won it by 100-odd votes, but they won it in 1929, and they may well win it in 1987. Now, this is a book called The Decline and Fall of the Labour Party. It's rather premature. It was written in 1930. Very good book. Whether you see it anywhere, get it, because it's wonderful writing. A man called John Scanlon, who was Wheatley's private secretary, his secretary actually worked for Wheatley, and a wonderful satirical journalist describing what happened when the 1929 government were elected. You might get a few echoes here. Mr. Wedgwood Bett! Good heavens. This is 1930, sorry. Mr. Wedgwood Bett, a new recruit from liberalism, was entrusted with the task of keeping Gandhi in order, and found it could only be done by putting him in prison. Sir Patrick Hastings had gone from politics, and Sir William Jowett, who had just been returned as an individualist Liberal, found no difficulty in adopting the collectivist constitution of the Labour Party, and accordingly was given Sir Patrick's place as Attorney General. The minor offices were much as usual. All the pacifists, with the exception of Mr. Leach, were back again running the war services. And Mr. Shinwell, because that is actually the same one. And Mr. Shinwell, because he'd learned a little about mines in 1924, was now removed to the Admiralty. And the post in 1924 and refused to buy a court suit. Mr. W.F. Jowett, who also refused to dress up in 1924, was dropped with Mr. Wheatley. If there was to be unity in the cabinet, all must not only think alike, but dress alike. That was the tone, really, of the 1929 government. The most brilliant appointment which Macdonald made was to appoint as the man in charge of unemployment, which was the issue above all else on which they fought the election, on the absolutely scandalously high unemployment figure in May 1929 of 1,132,297, had appointed our old friend Jimmy Thomas as the Lord Privy Seal who was going to deal with unemployment. Now, because I don't believe this thing about Marxism being a huge meeting, I bring things around to show around. See, when we first started off, you could show a book around. Have a look at this book, 10 people would look at the book. Don't know if you can see this. This is Jimmy Thomas's autobiography, right? And so it's his book. I mean, he's chosen this book. It's not satirical or anything like that. He was asked to provide a photograph for the frontispiece, the main photograph there. I don't know how many of you can see this picture of Jimmy Thomas. He's got good eyes, I don't know if you can see it. Anyone can come up and look at it afterwards. But the caption, just to give you a little flavour of it, the Right Honourable J.H. Thomas arriving at St James's Palace for a levee. Now you'll see it there for a levee. It's going for a levee there. That's the picture which he's chosen, by the way. And you will see that he's very properly dressed there. Got the sword, you need a sword if you go for a levee. You definitely need a sword. And he's got all the gold braid here. I don't know where he got that, He didn't even fight in the war, but anyway. And, he wouldn't have medals. I don't know, I can't remember. Anyway, there you are. That is Jimmy Thomas, that's it. Now, he gets surprised by the House of Commons with this announcement on the question of unemployment in September 1929. I have a complete cure. There are a few people who won't work, and we can't do anything for them. But for all ordinary forms of unemployment, yes, he got a complete cure. He didn't reveal what it was. It was a bit of a mystery. And he said, people got up, Tories and things, what is your cure? We tried to find a cure. Not telling it. I'm going to Canada. Going to Canada. The answer was in Canada. There were some jobs or orders or something in Canada. No one knew. Anyway, he went to Canada. And then he came back and said that he hadn't got any job there. And every month, unemployment went up by about 100,000. Anyway, you see, Jimmy Thomas wasn't worried about that. He then got the cure, but the optimism was still there in his speeches. I'll give you some of his speeches. So let's go. November the 4th, 1929, speaking from a close examination of the facts, I have no hesitation in saying that there is a trade improvement. That was November the 4th, 1929. January the 11th, 1930. I have faith in the future of this old country. We are not, as they think abroad, down and out. If you feel moved, by the way, incidentally, we're all comrades together. I don't mind if you give expression to how moved you are. January 18th, 1930, we can pull through. We will pull through. I strike the note of optimism. Based on past experience, we are not down and out. February the 20th, 1930. Black as the cloud may appear, there is a silver lining. February the 27th, 1930. I think the bottom has been reached. I ask you to drop this pessimism. This old country is not down and out. Mayday! Mayday! I frankly admit that there is a cloud on the horizon. But I do believe the worst is past. I believe there is a silver lining. May the 20th, when the tide turns, this old country will beat all records. Well, the tide didn't turn. It went on, unemployment, on and on and on. And all the specific promises that were in the 1929 manifesto, those very marginal, low aspiration promises which were made in order to get the maximum amount of votes, all of them were dropped. 1927, Trade Union Act, that was going to be repealed, it wasn't going to be repealed. The Miners' 8 Hours Act, that was going to be changed, that wasn't going to be changed. Nationalisation of the mines and the work, that was going to come in the second set of parliaments, that never, in the second session of parliament, that never came. There were cuts in public spending. And the government was just taken and tossed like a cork on the capitalist tide. Wherever it moved, whenever the newspapers blazing something out, the ministers scurried out. They were just shifted and moved and pushed and shifted until in 1931 the demand was made that more cuts had to be made, and this time in the unemployment benefit. There were so many people unemployed, you see, that they couldn't afford to pay them benefit. And the Tories joined in a tremendous chorus with the Liberals, and eventually persuaded the man who had so enthusiastically supported the gradual supersession of the old social order for the new, to join the Tories with his senior ministers, particularly with Snowden, to go across to the other side of the bench, to stay as Prime Minister, and to go to the country at the head of a thing called the National Coalition, the National Party, which was really the Tory party, headed by Ramsey Macdonald, which won an election victory which left only 50-odd MPs in Parliament. You know all about that, and there's no need to go into the depth of the story. But perhaps I could just, for a moment, just say one or two things about this. People say that all this shows, for years in the Labour movement, people have said that this shows the danger of one-man betrayal, that what happened here was a man who betrayed his party and betrayed his class, and that he's held up as an absurd and ridiculous figure, which undoubtedly he was, an absurd and ridiculous figure who doesn't represent the genuine people in the Labour Party who wanted to change society. And of course there is a marginal element of truth in that, is that he was plainly worse than the others. But before you even think of running away with that alibi, I want to come back to some of the things that I said and ask you to remember, if you remember, a set of names for people who have been associated with the formation of socialist clubs and socialist manifestos in 1925. George Lansbury, he was in the Macdonald cabinet. Marion Phillips, she was the strongest supporter on the backbenches of the Anomalies Bill, which went so hard for the unemployed. Susan Lawrence, she was a member of Macdonald's government. She was constantly hostile to any left-wing member of Parliament or anyone outside who dared to criticise the government. John Skerr was chairman of the consultative committee which was set up to try Maxon and Wheatley every time they supported the programme which John Skerr had written in 1925. And the whole package, the whole of this drift, all the way through, is held together, not just by Macdonald himself, but by that form of politics which believed that a system of society controlled so ruthlessly as capitalism controls the system of society can be changed just by a vote of the ballot box, by gradual manoeuvre and supersession. The rhetoric was appalling, but the rhetoric was well received in the Labour Party right up to the end. Best book of all this, by the way, of course, is Ralph Miliband's Parliamentary Socialism. All it does have a conclusion, but this is a wonderful book. And I just want to read a passage from Macdonald's speech, the Labour Party conference in 1930, the last Labour Party conference of which he was the leader of the party. This is, as Miliband says, a wonderful example of what we're dealing with here when we're dealing with waffle and cant at the top of the movement, but not just waffle and cant, which is yearned for, thirsted for, by people who believe that they can change society in a comfortable way. As a result of the most careful examination and testing and producing of schemes and ideas, we have come to the conclusion that the work of every constructive government must be to put its population on the land. Private. Hear, hear. There is something permanent. There is a case of planting. There is a case where you take men, I don't mean their bodies only, but their minds and their souls, off the pavements, which have no roots and no rootable capacity, and put them in the fields, where they will till, and they grow, and they sow, and they harvest. Loud cheers. And then he goes on. Capitalism has broken down not only in this little island, it has broken down in Europe, in Asia, in America. It has broken down everywhere, as it was bound to break down. And the cure, the new path, the new idea is organization. Organization which will protect life, not property, but protect property in proper relation to life. Organization which will see to it that when science discovers and inventors invent, the class that will be crushed down by reason of knowledge shall not be the working class, but the loafing class. That is the policy that we are going to pursue. Slowly. Steadily. Consistently, with knowledge, and with our minds working upon a plan. And I appeal to you, my friends, today, it's 1930, I appeal to you, my friends, today, with all that is going on outside, I appeal to you to go back onto your socialist faith. None of you will see the fabric finished, but I think it will be your happiness as it is mine to go on convinced that the great foundations are being well laid, that the ennobling plan is being conceived, and that by skilled craftsmen, confident in each other's goodwill and sincerity, the temple will rise and rise and rise until at last it is complete, and the genius of humanity will find within it an appropriate resting place. He ended with these words, I promise you, he ended with these words, on and on and on, and up and up and up. The standing ovation that he received for that speech, that's the end of his speech, which was received with a unanimous standing ovation from the entire Labour Party, all the ILP, all the people that were against him, were amazed and delighted at the way in which he could find its utter drivel and waffle, the most appalling kind, meaning nothing whatever, put together to unite them all and bring them on to a wonderful climax, a great orgasm of enthusiasm that took place in the Labour Party 4 months before it was thrown out of office for 15 years. And see, it's a familiar story really. We do have a low-born waffler now. That's what we've got, the leader of the Labour Party, a low-born waffler. And the Tory tide is ebbing in voting terms after a big strike has been defeated. And there is a mood of witch hunt, nastiness, and the rhetoric coming at it again. At the time we can't get away from it because it comes into our rooms all the time through the television. The rhetoric over and over again. I think there's two very, very big differences about this, just to end with. And the first is that we can laugh, and it is funny really, in an awful sort of way, when you look back at the history all those years ago, a long time ago, 50 years ago and more, a very long time ago. And it's easy to laugh at those people then, and to say how ridiculous they look, and how absurd it was that they should put aspirations in so little. And it's worth saying this, that at that time, this theory that you could change society through voting, through going to the election, voting in the Labour government, had not been tested. It wasn't tested. There was no way in which anyone could say, we can prove it won't work. They could refer to all sorts of things that happened in Germany. They could put in Noske and Scheidemann and all that rubbish there in Germany and see what happened there when they tried this reformist road. But in terms of British politics, and people like to think, we're different here, and it wasn't the same in Germany, and Macdonald very often in those speeches before they got office used to attack Noske and Scheidemann and say, we're not like that, we're not the Noskes. Actually, he had a Noske up his sleeve, that was Jimmy Thomas. That picture there of Jimmy Thomas in his refinery is exactly like Noske. That's exactly the role. They love uniforms, dressing up and talking to generals. They got a real kick out of it. How did you win how did they win the Battle of Plessy? Let's get over that and all this. So he had his Noske. But there wasn't any proof, there wasn't any certainty that in British conditions, even Marx had said, way back before the Paris Commune, changed his mind after the Paris Commune, of course, but even Marx had said that universal suffrage is political power for the working class. And it looks as though if everybody votes, that does create a power, and in a sense it does create a certain power. Not useless, not pointless, it's not absolutely futile, not none of those things at all. But then they haven't tested it. Now the thing is tested. Now it is, we know that people cannot get away now with this argument. And the challenge, if you like, for people like us now is in a sense a much easier one than it was for people in 1920s, because we've had all the whole of our lifetime we've had. All that he died when I was born. Okay, whole of my lifetime, we've had these examples all the time shown. Attlee, Wilson, Callaghan. 30 years of what happened. Much better conditions than Macdonald ever was in. What happened when they got huge majorities in Parliament, 1945, 1966. How the system came and crushed them, turned them, moved them. How the left-wing resurgence that took place within the party, every time they were crushed, built up to a little bit and then faded out again. And how there has been a consistent pattern of decline, a pattern of decline in the association of people in the ideas of the Labour Party. How their enthusiasm for it, the numbers have gone down, the enthusiasm for it has gone down, the belief, the feeling that society can be changed in this way, the idealism and the enthusiasm, those things are a consistent pattern of decline, all the way through the whole of the period since it started, and certainly since the half century since these events that I've described today took place. The thing is proved that it doesn't work, and therefore those that say it does really have much more for us to answer for. We can go much more on the offensive to take them and say, look what happened before, are you going to have it happen again? And I really refer to Tony Benn, of all people, who I was speaking with him on a miners' platform up in Wembley not long ago over the winter months, and he said, I drove him home, and on the way home he said, when I think about it, Wilson lasted 3 years the first time, and 2 years the second time, and even Callaghan lasted 6 months. That was being very generous, by the way. But Kenneth only lasted 6 weeks. That's Tony Benn's view, not the view he... I think he had a rather different view when he was interviewed by Tertius Worker the other day. However, that was the view he expressed to me off the record, so I'm now putting it on the record. Because I agree with it. Because it's absolutely fatuous to imagine that in these circumstances, with the degree in which the penetration, in those days they did have a penetration in the working class movement, and the votes represented real agitation, real change of mind. People will end up with this. In those days, they had to win the argument to get the vote. They had to win the argument not just with the Liberal Party, but with capitalism. That's why you had even parliamentary debate, socialism v capitalism. People talked about socialism v capitalism inside the mainstream of the movement. They had to do that in order to win the vote, and even when you laugh at all these books, Socialism Critical and Constructive by J.R. Macdonald, there's a lot of good arguments for the socialist society here. And in a sense, when they cleverly directed their attack upon syndicalism then and said it isn't an answer just to go for just to the industrial muscle, because there's all kinds of problems about the unevenness of the industrial muscle. There's a problem about some people being strong, some people being weak. There's a people about counting out the weak and the feeble and the old and the disabled and all those people out of that movement. And socialism is a broader, tougher thing than syndicalism. In a sense, they were right. These people today don't make those arguments. They don't win those arguments. They don't bother with them. And therefore, the responsibility falls down on us. The arguments have declined. The arguments for socialism, which they put, the arguments have declined among the masses whose allegiance, electoral allegiance, they still hold. They've declined because they haven't been able to put those arguments into practice. The arguments themselves perish. Socialism itself isn't a strong argument anymore because no one's been able to carry it into effect. And therefore the blend of where the power is with the socialist ideas running with the power becomes more and more imperative. Not more and more imperative, but fields opening out for us all the time, more there, because they're not concerned in either thing. They're not concerned either to vote for socialism or to be able to carry out even the miserable reforms which they propose. We're concerned with changing the society, with blending the power that can change society with the ideas. You have to win the argument for socialism as well as showing different ways in which it can be carried out. I think, if you think of Ramsey Macdonald over those 50 years, that's probably the most important lesson. Thanks very much.